Well, my name is Dina Crook, and like Lindsay said, I get the privilege of being the parent education coordinator. There we go. So my background is I was originally a special education teacher, so I have served in the trenches. I also got my background, or I got my master's in reading and started working with students with dyslexia and learning disabilities. I've worked in a classroom with kids with emotional disabilities, but then I got a lucky break and was asked to go teach at Texas State University, where I taught for 20 years, pre-service teachers, so I've been in that field. I have I have a child with special needs. The funny thing is, it's quite ironic. I know how to teach kids how to read phonetically, but I don't know how to teach kids how to read sight word wise. So I've been learning a lot about working with students with Down syndrome. And then I work with a lot of families in this district and other districts to help navigate them through the process of 504 and special education. So I might talk about cases or clients, and it's not all just around my own child, it's around other students. So let's talk about the neat thing about 504 and an IEP, which is under the special education umbrella, is that students can have accommodations in each. That is one of the most common things, or a commonality between the two different types of plans, a 504 plan or an IEP, which is under special education. So let's talk about, we're going to talk about what is an accommodation. We're going to talk about the different types of accommodations that you can have in IEPs and 504s, and then we're going to talk about some special notes about accommodations. We're going to talk about things you as the parent can do before the ARD or the 504 meeting, because the ARD is also the IEP meeting, the special education meeting. Texas, we're one of the few states that still call it an ARD meeting, which stands for Admission, Review, and Dismissal. But if you talk to a friend in another state and you say ARD and they look at you funny, you go, oh, an IEP meeting. So there's some jargon right there. We're going to talk about accommodations in the STAAR test. We're going to talk about accommodations in AP or honors classes, and then we're going to talk about looking beyond and into the future, past the public school system of K through 12, and accommodations for post-secondary, for the ACT, and the SAT. So that's kind of where we're going in this direction. So let's first talk about what an accommodation is. An accommodation is a change, okay? It is a change that removes different barriers that a person might have with disabilities to equal their learning, okay? Access to learning. What it does not do is modify the curriculum, okay? So we'll talk about what the difference between an accommodation is and a modification is, but basically what an accommodation does is it provides a level playing field. So when we look at this picture, we can see that we have three different students here, but only one of the students is able to access watching the soccer game. So there's some barriers to the two other students. We don't want to change the ability to watch the soccer game, but we want to provide the accommodations that allow that to happen. So we unsafely put this child on 2 boxes. And then we roll this child up a ramp and pray they don't roll backwards. But you see that we didn't change the view or the ability to watch the soccer game. We just changed how it's being done. And that would be the accommodation. So when we talk about accommodations, we'll go a little bit deeper. An accommodation, it's change made to the way the student is expected to do something at school. So, for example, we often have students read, right? And if we are working with a student with dyslexia and their reading ability is not equal to that of their peers, we can have the text read to them so that they can access the information that is in that text. Or, now we're getting really savvy, we can have the computer read it to them, because the Chromebooks have that extension that can be put in there so that we can have speech to text. No, wait, text to speech. I always get them confused, y'all. So that would be an example of how we change the way we do something. We can make a change that allows the student to complete the same task as their peers do, and we can change the time, the format, the setting, or the presentation. And one of the accommodations that would fit that would be allowing for extra time on a test, because some students need extra time on a test. Another thing that we can do is we can have students do the same task or assignment, but we might reduce the amount that they do to what's called TEKS mastery. So they're still doing the same objective, multiplication problems by multiplying by 5, but instead of having to do 100 to show mastery, we have them do 25 to show mastery. Okay, so we're not changing what it looks like, we're just changing the task, but they're still learning the same objective as their peers. We can make changes that are designed to eliminate barriers to full participation in school. So one of the things that I always think about when I think about this slide, because I have seen this, is that sometimes kids are not given resource because they had poor behavior in class or because they didn't finish their work. So the punishment is resource. But our kids, especially our kids with attentional issues and have a lot of energy, we've just given them something by taking away recess. We've given them a barrier to full participation of their other peers. So I've written in IEP plans, do not take away recess for these things. So that's just something else that I have seen. So that kind of gives you a little bit about accommodations. And again, I'm going to show you this picture because sometimes pictures speak better than words for other people. When we think about accommodations, we're thinking of equity versus equality. Equality is giving everybody the same thing in order, giving them the same thing. And it's a horizontal access. So when we think of that first picture of the students watching the soccer game and they all had no help, they were just standing there, that was equity. They all got the same thing to help them watch the soccer game, standing on the ground. Equity is giving students what they need, and it's on a vertical axis because different students need different levels of supports or accommodations. Okay? So what is the difference between an accommodation and a modification? Again, the accommodation is not changing what the students are learning or how it's not changing what they're learning, it's changing how they are learning. So again, we can do text to speech. So maybe we have a dysgraphic student or a student who has trouble with handwriting. They have all the ideas up in their head. They have to write an essay. They can speak it into the computer, and the computer will do the physical formation of the letters by typing them. I had a college student at the end of the semester, and she yelled out to me, "Hey, Dr. Crook." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said to me, "All of the things I turned in this semester, my lesson plans, my reports, my reflections, I did text to speech or speech to text. Were you able to tell?" And I was like, "No, ma'am, I could not." So it's a really good way of removing that barrier, because I know for some kiddos, handwriting is very difficult and it takes 2 hours to do something. When they can speak it, it takes 2 minutes, okay? A modification is changing what they are learning. So for example, we can have a student in 5th grade and all the 5th graders in the classroom are learning how to do long division. Okay, so they're doing the remainders and all the things that go with long division. But then we have another 5th grader in the classroom where the work is modified, and all that student is doing, or not all, what that student is doing is they're doing division by single numbers. We've changed the curriculum, okay, what they're expected to learn. Questions about what an accommodation is? Okay, so this is in your 504 plan or in your IEP, you'll have this, I guess, thing that looks like this, an accommodation, a piece of paper that says accommodations. Now, the 504 accommodation page and the special education IEP accommodation page look slightly different, but they still have the same goal, okay, of what they do. So you'll be able to see that. You'll have the accommodation, and then you'll have all the different subjects that the student is in, and you check off what or where that accommodation would be. Not all the time are all the checks under the same subjects. I mean, sometimes you don't need an accommodation for math because the student really rocks it at math, okay? So this example up here just happens to have everything checked off, but you as a committee decide where that student, what subject that child, your child, needs the accommodation in or does not need the accommodation in. Because we don't want to give everything under the sun to the child, just thinking about the future, and I'll talk about that in a second, why we don't really, I mean, we want to give them what they need, don't get me wrong. But we say, oh, that sounds good, and if they don't really need it, well, don't check it, because you're just hurting that child. All right, so let's talk about it. One of the types of accommodations that can be done in the classroom is adapt classroom instruction. So here are 3 examples of things for adapt classroom instruction. The opportunity to repeat and explain directions. So if we have a child who has executive functioning problems, attentional issues, and so they missed it. Can you remind me what I just said? And repeat it. And then the teacher knows if they understood what's going on. Now, I should say an accommodation is something that that child needs that's not being done for the rest of the students in the class. For example, if you say the child needs wait time, and the good teaching practice is giving wait time. That's like 1 to 3 seconds of being able to think about an answer or process information. So if you put wait time down and everybody else is getting wait time, you really don't need to put it in the accommodations. However, some children need wait time that is longer than 3 seconds, and that's when you would put it in. And you would say, provide wait time up to 10 seconds before student responds, okay? All right, preferential seating. Where is the best place for that student to sit in the classroom? Not all the time is it up front right near the teacher. I remember I had one little boy, and he was in constant movement all the time. He sat at the back of the classroom. He got up and he was allowed to pace back and forth in the room so long as I said, Anthony, what are we talking about? He could tell me, he could just keep on moving. He had preferential seatment or preferential movement at that time. Another thing that we can do is we have kids sometimes who have really high anxiety, and so calling on them will just throw off their day. So we can have an accommodation of do not call on the student unless the student volunteers. And of course we want the teacher and that student to feel confident so that one day that student raises their hand to volunteer to answer a question. And these are just 3 examples of accommodations for adapt classroom instruction. Another type of accommodation that you'll see on the IEP or the 504 sheet are accommodations that deal with adapted or additional materials. So I work with one student who has severe dysgraphia, and cutting is so hard for this student. And so there was an accommodation that pre-cut materials be provided for this student. And she uses this still continued in middle school because it's so slow. And they do cut in middle school, believe it or not. There is cutting and gluing in middle school. Some students need a visual checklist because we only remember 10% of the words we hear, but we remember about 20 to 30% of what we see. We remember 50% of what we see, we remember 90% of what we do. So we can do a visual checklist for multi-step assignments. And I used to have a stack of Post-it notes on one student's desk, and I would just number out step 1, and she would rip it off and she would do it, and I'd do in the next Post-it note when she finished step 1, step 2. Now we have fancy ways of doing things. That was before the whole technology thing. And then this is a big one for secondary, is provide a hard copy, that's important, hard copy, that means it has to be printed out, of notes prior to class. Because some kids have trouble copying from a far point to a near point. Some kids have a hard time focusing on what's going on, and they don't get everything copied down like they need to get copied down. Sometimes our handwriting impedes our ability to take notes. So, she went to the bathroom, I think.
I was saying there's chairs. There's chairs up here. There's chairs over in the corner, and some over here as well.
So those are
sit down.
So those are some different ways of adapted or additional materials that can be provided. Then we can alter testing or assignments. When they start getting into middle school and high school, we can give extra time. We can give extra time in at the elementary level too, don't get me wrong. But when we hit middle school and high school, we need to define how much extra time that we're going to give somebody. And it's 50%. It can be higher than that, so that when they roll into their ACT or SAT, we have history of extra time and how much extra time was provided. For students with dyslexia or learning disabilities in the area of language, well, there's not language arts, but in written expression, where there's spelling difficulties, we cannot penalize. We can write in no penalty for spelling errors unless revising the text with the teacher. I think that's important because we have to learn, students need to learn to be accountable for their spelling after they reviewed it with the teacher. Right? So we talked about how to spell the word "the." We circled it. You need to go fix it now in your final draft and spell it correctly. And then we've already talked about this, shortening assignments to teach mastery. So instead of doing 100, they might do only 50 or 25, depending on what's negotiated between what the teacher thinks. And again, you have to hit all the TEKS. So some homework assignments have more than one TEKS in there, on them. So when I say multiplication of 5s, that's an easy one to reduce. But sometimes we have to really look and say, okay, which TEKS are we hitting? And is there more than 2 or 3 that we might pull out of that assignment? That becomes important. Another one is managing behaviors. So some students have difficulty with their behavior. What are some accommodations that we can do to help them access their learning and take away the barriers? We can use first if-then statements, first-then statements, private discussion concerning behavior. This is a big one because sometimes when you discuss the child's behavior in front of all of their peers, guess what happens? Explosion, right? So having a private discussion and reminders to stay on task. Again, I'm just giving you some examples of what these are so that you know how the example fits the category of managed behaviors. Okay. So here's one that I see a lot under managed behavior. I see it at the elementary level, and then when I start to see it at the middle school level, I just kind of laugh. Positive reinforcement. Well, most teachers are really good about positively reinforcing a child. Good job, way to go. So when you see that, you want to say, well, what kind of positive reinforcement? What are you going to do to positively reinforce my child's behavior that may be different than you're doing for the whole classroom? So that's really important because if the whole classroom's getting positive reinforcement, then does it really need to be on there? Or does your child need a different level of positive reinforcement, like a token system or reward system, to help them to be successful? And if that's the case, let's write it in there. Reward system, token system, point system, because when I'm a teacher and I look at positive reinforcement, I'm going, oh yeah, I do that for everybody, it's no big deal, right? But the people writing the plan might have had a different vision of what that positive reinforcement is. The more specific we can make the accommodation, the better, because we want anybody reading the accommodation to understand what that accommodation is. So I'm going to go back to the class notes example. Copy of class notes prior to class. Well, the teacher's like, well, everybody has a copy of my class notes prior to class. it's already online. They just can access them through Google Classroom. No, 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 no. That's why we write in hard copy, so that that child has a hard copy before they enter the classroom. It's there for them to pick up, use, write on, and then they look like everybody else taking notes, don't they, as they're doing that. So something to think about. So because what one teacher thinks an accommodation is, another teacher might not think of that accommodation is. They interpret them differently, and that's okay. So the more specific we can be, the better, so everybody understands what that accommodation is. There's also required equipment or assistive technology. So once students hit the 5th grade, they can have a 4-function calculator. So they know how to work the word problems. They know I'm supposed to add, and then I'm supposed to subtract, and then I'm supposed to multiply to figure out this word problem. But their calculation skills aren't very good. So we're going to give them a calculator because they know how to do the process, and they're always going to hopefully have a calculator with them. We have them on our phones, we have them on our watches, we have them on our computers, right? Speech to text, that's when I speak something and it turns it into text for me. Text to speech, that's when something reads it to me. And then some students need an alternative communication device, a board, to help them to be able to speak. So those are the different types of accommodations with examples of each. Special notes. These are some things to know about accommodations. Before you go to an ARD meeting or a 504 meeting, just reach out and say, hey, will you send me a draft of the IEP for the special education meeting, the ARD? Or will you send me a draft of the 504 with any proposed new accommodations in it or any that you're taking out? Because things change from year to year. And you have to have an annual ARD every year, but you only have to have a 504 every 3 years. But it's always good practice to have a 504 meeting every year because the child's learning changes. They change developmentally. Things they might have needed in the 2nd grade, they no longer need in the 5th grade. Or they might need more supports now that they're in middle school than they did in elementary school. Something to consider and think about. Read through those accommodations and think, yeah, this is something they really need, or, oh, I don't think that they need this anymore. Or you might have an idea for an accommodation yourself. And you're like, well, I don't know what the smorgasbord of accommodations are. Then you think, okay, what is my child having difficulty with? Go back and think, what do they need? So I was in a recent ARD meeting, and the mom was like, you know, my child's dysgraphic, and you gave them a map to fill out, and they had a little itty bitty space to write the map. And then they had to color that map. And I was like, oh, well, we can make an accommodation where they can scan the worksheet in, and the child can type the name of the country in that space. Or they can take the spaces and enlarge them, or they can have pre-cut out labels of the space, things that need to be on the map, and they can just stick them on there without having to cut. So there's ways around it. So one of the things that you should always do in a 504 meeting, or whether you're in ARD, an IEP meeting, is you should talk about those concerns. And we should be thinking about what can we do to help with these concerns, because you know where the struggle is. Organization is a struggle, right? So maybe having a visual checklist when we walk in the door for an elementary school student of the things that need to be done would be an accommodation to help them from melting down. You know, first we do this, we put this in our cubby, then we do this, then we do this. So those are those accommodations. And so you know your children the best. Bring the things, the difficulties they're having, and talk about them, and they can become, hopefully, accommodations that you and the committee can agree upon. Now, if you're working with an older student, so I usually, my 4th and 5th graders and up, pull them aside and let them, they need to see their accommodation sheet. It's not a hidden thing from them. They need to know their accommodations, because we're going to start advocacy here. But look at the accommodations with them. Which ones do they like? Which ones are really working for them? That's important. Which ones do they not prefer? Because if they don't prefer them, they're not going to do them, and they're going to resent the teacher who's making them do them. It needs to come out of there. You're like, but you need that. And you're like, she's like, I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it. They get to have some autonomy in this process of accommodations. And then this one, which ones are not being provided? And they'll tell you straight up, I am not getting extra time on my test. I'm not getting a hard copy of my notes. I'm not getting an extra day. I don't have a rubric with all the due dates on it. Talk to them, and they need to know what their accommodations are again. Also, something to consider doing, again, starting for this self-advocacy. We've had fourth graders come into ours, and we talk about their accommodations with them present. They talk about them, they tell them they tell the team how it's going, what they like, what they don't like, but somebody's prepared them ahead of time. You never just take a kid and throw them into an ART or a 504 meeting, right? The teacher or you as the parent have sat down and really prepped them for this part. And a lot of times we just have them stay for that part, and sometimes ART facilitators are really nice and they just let us do the accommodations first, even though there's agenda, right? So they can get back into class after they've covered those things. And the older they are, the longer they should stay in an ARD. But that's, hey, we're going to talk about that. When's our parent in October? Yes. So come to Parent Education day or night. It's both. And I'll be presenting with Christy Griffin, and we'll be talking about preparing kids to be self-advocates and get ready for the post-secondary world. So review those accommodations in both the 504 and the ARD meeting before you go into them. Talk to your child about those. And then something you need to know for accommodations and STAAR is that you cannot have a STAAR accommodation unless it's on the main accommodation page. I was actually not this district, so don't worry. I was actually in an ARD last week, and I looked at the STAAR accommodations, and I looked at the child's accommodations, and I'm like, you have this accommodation for STAAR, but you don't have it in their generalized accommodations. And I got look, and I'm like, you can't have it here if you don't have it here. So that's something to be aware of. So if the child gets small group administration in the STAAR, then they should have small group administration in their general accommodations, which happens a page or two before here. Okay, AP and honors classes. Okay, nobody be offended with this. All right, here we go. If the child with a disability is in an AP and honors class, and they have accommodations, if you want a new accommodation for them, extended time. But they don't need that extended time if they were in the general ed on-level class. They cannot have that accommodation in the AP or honors class. I know. But what that does is it now makes an unlevel playing field. So you only get the accommodation in an AP or honors class if you would need it on that on-level class. Makes sense? And that, I know, frustrates some parents, but maybe if you need a lot of accommodations in AP or honors classes, but don't need them in the on-level class, maybe the AP or honors class is not the best place for you. P.S. Colleges are looking more at a 4.0 GPA than they are a 5.0. So pushing them through the honors classes and the AP classes won't benefit them for GPA. Might get them some more college credit if they pass the AP course, but that's another story for another time. All right. So when you start looking towards the future, my daughter Hannah, she's already graduated college, but she had generalized anxiety disorder. And, I kept on talking to her, we really should get, you under 504. No, Mom, no, Mom, no, Mom. She went to go take the ACT and the SAT, the SAT, and she was like, I didn't have enough time. Okay. She goes, how can I get extended time? I said, well, you're not going to. She goes, what? I said, you know, we haven't had the accommodation in place 6 months under a 504 plan. You're not getting it. So just FYI, you just can't add in an accommodations for SAT or ACT right before the test. The accommodation has to have a history of being shown. It's usually recommended 6 months of being shown. And then you always have to look towards the future. One of the things that I like to do with my 11th and 12th graders is look at their accommodations and talk with them. Hey, you have this accommodation here in high school, but it's not considered to be a reasonable accommodation at the college level. So you're probably not going to get it. And you want to start paring down to those accommodations that they really, really, really need, and not everything again under the kitchen sink, because it's not going to be setting them up for success if they're moving towards that post-secondary education. So one of the things that you typically cannot get in post-secondary education is extended time on an assignment. You had a syllabus. It had the calendar dates on when the assignment was due, because by state law on a syllabus that has to happen. And so you need to know that. So you might get that in high school, but you are probably not going to get it in college. In college, you will get extended time on testing. You'll take your test in a testing center. So that's what I mean. You really need to kind of start to look, how can we set my child up for success when they fly at the coop? They're gone, because you know, once they hit the post-secondary, Mama Bird, you cannot go in there and say you're not following their accommodations, because nobody's going to talk to you, because they're only going to talk to your child, and your child has to be able to do it for themselves. Yes, your child can waive FERPA, but a lot of them don't want to. Yep. Okay, so I talked really fast, and you probably have some questions, and I think we have time for questions over accommodations.